Hey guys, Bartel's Bookshelf here with a recent reads video. Again, it's been a few weeks. I keep putting this off, but I'm finally filming this. As usual, apologies if I'm rambly, but I'm going to try to kind of be succinct and get through these. But yeah, I've been, diving headfirst into the spooky reads, for the season. And to close out September, I figured I should talk about some of the spooky reads I've been reading. These are all just kind of things that I pulled from a pile. I kind of had a little pile going of sort of spooky season reads, and these are just random ones that I pulled. But first off, I have The Funhouse by Dean Koontz. This is the republished edition later in the 90s, because originally he wrote this under the pseudonym, if you can see there. He originally wrote this under the pseudonym Owen West. He was one of those sort of work-for-hire writers who published a lot of stuff. I wanted to read this because, well, one, it's a spooky carnival stuff, and that's my jam. And two, I'd never really read a lot of Dean Koontz, but people say this is actually a novelization of this 80s slasher movie called The Funhouse that was directed by Tobe Hooper. I meant to watch the movie. I haven't had a chance to yet. But from what I understand, the novelization basically expands on the film greatly, adding all this like backstory and stuff. So this tells the story of a young teen girl. She's like 17. It's about this girl named Amy, whose mother is like super religious. Very. Fire and brimstone type, alcoholic. And through an extended prologue, they reveal that Amy's mother, Ellen, was ran away with the carnival when she was young. She also had like a very sort of strict religious mother, and the guy that she ended up marrying at the carnival was this creepy guy who had this sort of like air of like spookiness about him, but that also made him kind of romantic. And they gave birth to this like severely deformed child that she became convinced was of the devil, and she killed it. This is not a spoiler. This is all in the very beginning of the book. But then afterward, in the modern day, it follows her daughter, who's being subjected to similar treatment by her own mother, strict religious treatment. After she's run away and changed her name and everything. And then the carnival comes into town, and it turns out that the guy running the funhouse is the ex-husband that she married and that her mother married and had the baby with, and he wants revenge. So one of the things I found interesting about the book, as I say, I haven't read a lot of Dean Koontz. I thought this was okay. It wasn't terribly written. There was some interesting sort of character introspection stuff, especially given the fact that, as far as I understand it, again, I meant to watch the movie after reading this, but I haven't gotten around to it. The movie is kind of just a straightforward slasher, and basically follows kind of the last third of the book. And there's an afterword in here where Dean Koontz talks about, having to expand on the movie, because, and he's a little bit condescending, honestly. He's like, well, movies are good, but, they're no books and stuff like that, But yeah, it was okay. There's, it's kind of your typical sort of, as you can kind of tell from the synopsis there, there's a lot of, Carrie and stuff like that. A lot of it is sort of been there, done that. It's very sort of moralistic, as a lot of horror fiction often is. Lots of stuff about God, and sort of finding, the good version of God as opposed to the fire and brimstone version of God that Amy's mother presents and all this. But it's decent. It's not horrible. There's some when it gets to like the actual carnival stuff and you're on the midway and people are getting killed and stuff, it gets a lot more exciting. There's a pretty cool climax, which I need to watch the movie because if that's how it is, if it's depicted how it is in the book, then it's pretty awesome. And, and there's a lot of stuff about, like, carny culture and some of, what draws people to these places. And, I think it captures that mood really well. You can tell that Koontz did a lot of research. And, in fact, in the afterword, he talks about having a lot of, interest and done a lot of research for carnivals, which he put to more sort of extensive use in his novel Twilight Eyes, which I also have and I want to read because the carnival stuff I liked. The stuff outside of it was, a little kind of melodramatic and over the top and... focused a little bit too much on sort of like vague Christian moralizing for my taste, but it wasn't terrible. It was interesting. Kind of when you think of like an airport read or a beach read, that's the sort of thing this was, which isn't bad, if you're in the mood for it. I mostly just found it interesting as a sort of oddity, being that, it's a novelization of a movie that basically only covers the movie in the last third of the book, and greatly expands on its backstory. And also the fact that due to, various, editing delays and stuff, the book actually came out before the movie, and apparently a lot of people thought the movie was based on the book when it was vice versa, so I thought that was kind of interesting. But anyway, that was Funhouse. Next, I have a sort of a spooky children's book here. This is The Witches of Worm by Zilpha Keatley Snyder. I got this from my library, so that's why it looks like this. I actually read this book on the recommendation of Cameron Chaney, who's another booktuber. He covers a lot of, a nostalgic horror, children's horror, that kind of stuff. Children's literature in general. I love his channel. He's such a cozy delight. And in a recent book haul video, he mentioned a Zilpha Keatley Snyder book he picked up, and he said, "Read The Witches of Worm." That's all I'll say. So that intrigued me enough to look her up because I'd never heard of her before. But she was a Newbery Award-winning author of books like The Egypt Game, The Headless Cupid, and this one, The Witches of Worm, all of which won the Newbery. So I was very eager to read this, and yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. This follows a girl named Jessica who's like very insular, very, lost in her own imagination, prone to making up stories and spending a lot of time on her own. And one day, as she's wandering out near some caves, she finds this mysterious, sort of ugly-looking, sort of hairless cat that looks like a worm, and she takes it home and starts feeding it, which she usually would never do because she hates cats. But she names the cat Worm, and over time, as she spends more time with Worm and kind of in her own thoughts and sort of going over the things that have happened to her in recent, over the past year, she kind of becomes very attached to Worm in a strange way, and Worm sort of starts speaking to her and saying that he's like a witch's familiar and telling her to do bad things. So this was a really interesting book, and I struggled with it for one specific reason that I'll get to, but I want to say first off, I thought this was really well written. Zilpha Keatley Snyder, her writing style, it has this sort of It's hard to describe. It's sort of a propulsive, sort of almost gothic atmosphere, but it's very subtle. It's very this sort of sense of encroaching dread rather than sort of an in-your-face shock. And since we spend all of our time pretty much inside Jessica's head, we're very much looking at the world, through her eyes and seeing them through her sort of romanticized, sort of gothic, sort of paranoid, way of seeing things. And that's all depicted really well. Jessica has frequent nightmares of, being left alone and stuff like that. And the way that these are depicted are very vivid and phantasmagoric and frightening, especially with the illustrations by Alton Rabel, which have this very sort of sketchy, I don't know if it's like pencil or charcoal, but it's very like scribbly and impressionistic, and it gives everything this kind of nervy energy, that I really, really like. My issue with the book came, I honestly wish I hadn't picked up this edition from the library because it came with an introduction from the author. And I usually like reading introductions if they're in a book, just to kind of set the scene, get some historical context, maybe some inspiration behind the book. But in her introduction, she talks a lot about how in the 70s, there were a lot of teenagers who were sort of using the supernatural to sort of get away with things, being like, it wasn't me, the devil made me do it. And she makes this an explicit connection in the book as well when Jessica reads a book about the Salem witches. And how and the girls who accused all the witches, were basically, hysterical and lashing out because, that's all they, because they enjoyed the power and the control. I'm not sure why. I thought about this for a long time. The thing that I struggled with by making that comparison is that it felt a little bit victim-blamey to me, It's not really, I'm not an expert on, the Salem witch trials, and obviously, the girls accusing the innocent women of what they did, and sentencing them to death was terrible. But it doesn't really seem like a one-to-one comparison because, for one, the bad stuff that that Jessica is compelled to do in the book does not. It doesn't result in the same amount of of horribleness. And I get that it's drawing a metaphor between drawing a through line between these two things, but there was just a sense of like. Well, it's this little girl who's alone, and struggling to reach out, and it seemed like it seemed to me with the, combined with the introduction, that the book was sort of saying it's kind of her fault, And granted, it is telling her to take responsibility for her actions. It's not, the whole point of it is that she's not allowed to, like, use an excuse like a witch's familiar to absolve her of things, I don't know. There was something a sort of victim blamey about it that sort of struck me the wrong way. But that's really... It's not really a count against the book. I think that's more just me bringing my interpretation to it, because, as I say, like, the book is written really well. It's believable. The sort of portrait of this little girl sort of lost in her own imagination is very convincing. In a way, it reminded me a lot of that other book I read by The Tulip Touch by Anne Fine, in that, they both deal with, sort of disturbed girls who, are prone to, like, maladaptive daydreaming and sort of, like, destructive little games and stuff. But whereas, like, The Tulip Touch had this very, like, sort of righteous fury and sort of anger to it, blaming, putting the blame squarely at, adults in the society that led to the, the creation of this girl, and the way that we dehumanize children who do bad things, this just kind of seemed like, oh, well, it's all her fault, I don't know. As I say, maybe this is just me bringing my own sort of interpretation to it. I will say, like, I was very touched by it because I related so much to the main character, myself being a bit of a maladaptive daydreamer. I never, did anything bad, but just I understand that sense of isolation and loneliness and sort of retreating into, your own little world, So I just felt very raw and sympathetic toward her. So, I don't know, maybe I was just coming at it from the wrong angle, but I do think it was a really well-written book, and the way that Snyder sort of straddles the line between reality and fantasy, where we start to question if it is all in her head or if it is real, kind of a turn-of-the-screw situation, was all really well done. It's just, I think that introduction just left a bad taste in my mouth, but I do want to read more of her stuff, especially the Egypt game, since that seems to be kind of the second favorite. So, yeah, definitely see how that goes. Next, I read a bit of a notorious one on BookTube. This is Dead Inside by Chandler Morrison. This is a pretty notorious extreme horror book that kind of made the rounds, back in like 2020, 2021, whenever it came out, and there was that first flourishing of sort of extreme horror, videos and discourse and stuff. And I wanted to read this because, it had become such a controversial thing, and I wanted to sort of see what all the fuss was about. And yeah, it was interesting. As this is an extreme horror book, this deals with very, like, screwed up things, so, if that bothers you, here's your warning. But I will try to sort of tiptoe around it, without fear of upsetting Daddy YouTube. So, but this deals with sort of a nerdy, sort of isolated guy, very sort of edgy and angry, quiet. He's a hospital security guard, and he enjoys working at the hospital because there's a morgue, and let's just say he likes dead bodies. But while going about his sort of nightly duties, he finds a maternity ward doctor there, a female maternity ward doctor, who also has a very strange craving. She likes to eat dead babies. And they sort of end up going on this fucked up kind of romance together. Obviously, based off of that premise, you can see why this upset so many people. Part of the reason I was intrigued by this is because some people took it very, very seriously and were very, very upset that, the author would depict these horrible things, and anybody who enjoys this type of stuff is a monster, and the author is a monster, blah, 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 blah. I think that's ridiculous, especially after having read the book, because the main character, what is his name? I'm horrible with character names, guys, I'm sorry. I don't know if he actually has a name. But yeah, him and the maternity ward doctor, that the guy himself, he's very because one of the things that people accuse this book of doing is being kind of an edgelord book. In my eyes, it's almost like making fun of that edgelord mentality, because the main character, the security guard in here, he's such a like over the top depiction of that. He's sort of scraggly, he wears glasses, he's a misogynist, he has all these sort of like nihilism chic viewpoints about reality, about how, nothing matters, and, morality is fiction, and all this stuff, and I think he's sort of satirizing that mentality, especially because, he keeps telling himself throughout the book, like, I don't get close to people, I don't do romance, I don't do things like that. But then through meeting this woman who has tastes that are just as fucked up as his are, you know. He sort of finds himself, like, terrified of like, that type of connection, you know, even if it is connection in this really messed up way. So in a way, I thought it was kind of, like, confronting that a little bit, and his own sort of hypocrisy. But I do understand, you know, people sort of seeing it as kind of an edgelord book in the sense that its primary motivation is to shock. I do think that there is an element of that, and that is something that I struggle with a lot of extreme horror, or stuff that's sort of, you know, touted under the extreme horror banner. I feel like a lot of it is going for shock and not much else. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but at the end of the day, it just kind of leaves you with, okay, well, so what? You know, to me, what makes a book disturbing is not necessarily what happens in it, but the way that those things are depicted, you know? I mean, because the thing is, yes, a lot of the stuff in here that happens is really screwed up. There's one scene in particular that I think a lot of people get upset about. And yes, it is disgusting, but it's depicted in such an over-the-top way that it's almost like a Looney Tunes cartoon. It's almost like a splat-stick movie, like, you know, Brain Dead or something, you know? And it's like, how could anybody take this seriously? But I will concede that I don't think it really has much interest in saying much beyond just being shocking and provocative. And there, as I say, there is value in that. But in this case, I just felt like there wasn't enough to really make me feel like I was taking anything away from it, you know? There is a bit of that sort of, like, edgy kind of troll mentality of, like, let's trigger people with this one, you know, and especially with the author's, the character, but it's really the author, you know, sort of name-dropping Will Self, who's another sort of very iconoclastic British author who writes very shocking sort of things, you know. But again, I mean, you could make the argument that that's the point of it, that it's satirizing that. I don't know. Personally, like, it was an interesting book. It was enjoyable. I thought it was written well. It just didn't leave me with a whole lot. And to me, like, you know, that's just, like, I'd rather have a strong feeling about a book rather than feeling indifferent, whether it's positive or negative, you know. But I borrowed this copy from my friend Andy, and he told me that Chandler Morrison's later books get a lot better, and this was well written enough that I think I would be interested in trying that out. So yeah, I mean, your mileage may vary. Obviously, it's very, very screwed up, so if you go into this, you know, expect every kind of taboo violation. So, you know, but if you're into that, give it a look. You know, I do think there is value in being transgressive. I mean, some of my favorite books and authors are transgressive. I don't know. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I kind of came down the middle on this one. And then finally, I read The Spirit Bares Its Teeth by Andrew Joseph White. I read Andrew Joseph White's first book, Hell Followed With Us, a few years ago, whenever that first came out, and I really, really enjoyed it. And my friend Laura also read it and really, really enjoyed it, and she read this book as well and was, like, praising it. So I always meant to get to it, and with, you know, spooky season approaching and just a lot of sort of thoughts on my mind about sort of, you know, queer people and, you know, what's going to happen in the future and stuff like that, just some of the things that we're going through, you know, currently. I think I just kind of needed something that was very sort of righteous and angry, and this definitely fit the bill. So this takes place in an alternate Victorian England where people are born with violet eyes, which has gives them the ability to speak with the dead. And in this, you know, very repressively patriarchal society, women with violet eyes are basically used as breeding stock, you know, to breed men, you know, to breed sons with violet eyes, so that, you know, they can go on to have, be powerful lineages, to have powerful lineages, and, you know, make money and contribute to the state and all that stuff. Because obviously, you know, if you're able to talk to the dead, that offers a lot of power. And in this world, they call them speakers. And speakers basically have all the power. They can get away with anything because, you know, they have these special abilities, you know, that allow them to communicate with the dead. And this focuses on a young trans autistic man who who wants to be a surgeon. He's been studying under his brother, you know, learning about, you know, the human body, you know, sort of in secret and practicing and stuff. But of course, you know, because he presents as female, you know, he's not able to to do that. But since he has the violet eyes, since he's able to become a speaker, he basically has this plan to, forge documents, posing as a man, get his little stamp that basically, ratifies him as a speaker, and he's able to, kind of move around with impunity and kind of go live his life. But he gets caught at this ceremony, this speaker initiation ceremony, and gets sent to this hospital for young girls with veil sickness, basically women who have communicated with the dead so many times over the years that it's driven them it's driven them mad, it's made their minds sick, and it basically turns into this very oppressive gothic sort of a supernatural thriller set in this very repressive, uptight, horrifying finishing school for girls. As you can imagine, all those sorts of themes, wrapped up in a book like this, they hit like a gut punch. Andrew Joseph White writes with such like beautiful, incisive prose. In this book, it's. I read a few reviews that said something similar, where they say the prose itself is very surgical. It's very matter of fact and very precise with the words that it uses and how it and the flow of the sentences and everything. It's beautifully written, and it really does sort of it's a very satisfying sort of scream into the abyss, of rage. The ways that it goes into sort of patriarchal societies, and the way that that queer people are perceived, and not just queer people but autistic people. I thought the autistic representation was really well done and very. It was just very believable in the way that it set you in the mind of this person and sort of helped you see things through their eyes without kind of hitting you over the head with it. And there's just some beautiful, concise metaphors that Andrew Joseph White uses in this book to sort of describe all those differing experiences of being an other, And it shocked me, too, because this book is, like, really violent and really dark. Obviously, I've read, some worse things in terms of, how they're described and graphicness and whatnot. But the fact that, this is written for, like, a sort of a teen audience, and it really kind of confronts these things head on, it doesn't shy away from anything, the horrible things that people do, in the name of, fixing, so-called aberrant people, It's just a very brutal, savage howl of a book, which was very much in line with Hell Followed With Us, although this is a little bit more kind of reserved, since it takes place in this Victorian sort of patriarchal society, but there's that bubbling anger under the surface, there's that like sort of a tingle of anxiety running throughout the book, which the narrator very deftly describes as sort of a rabbit in his chest, It's a beautiful, beautiful book. I really loved it. There were a few sort of little issues I had. I thought the romance was interesting, but it wasn't, incredible. They do sort of comment on certain things, like the quickness of it, that I was a little bit, like, put off by. But again, you kind of need... You need this sort of intersection of, like-minded people to kind of, like, have a story where they don't just give up. It talks about a very powerful theme, especially among, marginalized, and queer communities and stuff, about the need for community, for, like-minded people, And I thought that aspect of it was very beautiful. The actual romance itself I wasn't super convinced by, but they do kind of lampshade it a little bit, so it's okay. But generally, yeah, like, I really enjoyed this. Obviously, like, it's a heavy read. Like, I expected it to be a heavy read, but, like, it really, like, hit me, like, emotionally, especially with, our current climate and everything. So if you're sensitive to that kind of thing, I would not, I would, your mileage may vary. I would apply carefully. But I just thought it was a beautiful, just angry... Just passionate, plea for sort of understanding and tolerance and the rage that comes from, from oppression, and, it's just a beautiful book. I'm really glad I read it, and I've got another book of his here called Compound Fracture, that also sounds very good and also deals with an autistic teen, but this goes more into sort of I believe they're also trans. A trans autistic teen, and this also goes into sort of queer socialism and stuff like that. So I'm very interested to see what that's like. The reason, also part of the reason I wanted to sort of catch up with his bibliography is that he came out with a new book, You Were Never Meant to Be Human, which is his first adult debut. And I'm like, man, if these are the young adult reads, like, what is the adult one going to be like? So I definitely want to read the rest of his stuff before I read his new book. So yeah, that was great. Yeah, I'm really happy to end on something so positive. We're getting into October now, so looking forward to, diving headfirst into, all the spookiness. So expect to see more videos, revolving around that as often as I can. I'll try not to, sit on it too much like I've been doing, but I hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know if you've read any of these books or anything similar, anything that you're reading currently. Just, chat at me, talk to me. Until then, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.